And then people will get a hold of the stream, I think. Cool. So yeah, there it is.
Hey.
Okay. I'm just gonna check what I was saying. There we go. I'm just explaining to you how Go Live works. Right, everyone. So excited to see you and hear you and see your chat. Welcome to this new We Move session. I'm Jenny, the community and events manager at Music Hackspace. You've seen my face many times over if you've been to a We Move before. And if not, then welcome. If this is your first We Move, a special welcome to you. Hello. So today we have the marvelous Jess Camilleri. Did I say your name correctly?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Okay, fabulous. So we have Jess with us today, who's going to be talking to us about 7 things that you wish you knew before you hired a mix engineer. And obviously, if you haven't hired one yet, then this is the perfect time for you to be accessing this content, which is brilliant. And if you have, then I'm sure you'll pick up some stuff that you haven't heard before and be able to kind of glean some tips for yourself for the next time you hire a mix engineer. So before we get rolling, here's a bit about Jess. So actually, Jess and I have only physically met like maybe twice, I think, in the pre-pandemic times.
Yeah, I feel like the first time I met you was in person.
It was, because I remember Katie introduced us at Saffron's Tech Dissect event.
That's the one at Spitfire.
Yes. So since then, basically, we've been fanning at each other across the internet, being like, hey. So I'm really excited to have Jess do this session with us today. So Jess is a London-based recording and mixing engineer, and you've been working as a runner and assistant at, I like the fact that you called it the infamous Strongroom Studios and not the famous Strongroom Studios. We love Strongroom, by the way. We have lots of love for Strongroom. Strongroom is a famous studio in Shoreditch in London, and Jess is based there for a lot of her work, and she's been honing her recording skills and developing her love for working with independent artists as well. So you're currently freelance, and you divide your time between running recording sessions for some pretty impressive artists. I noticed M.I.A. and Rudimental on your CV, which is dead good. I was like, all right then, that's cool. But you've also been recording and mixing and producing for up and coming artists, and our mutual friend Jelly Cleaver is one, and some of Jelly's associated projects and All Day Breakfast Cafe and stuff. And so that's all just dead exciting. Well done.
Thank you. Oh no, it's all very good fun.
Good.
Cool.
Amazing. All right then. So having talked you up there, I'm now going to just hand over to you to deliver the presentation, and I'm going to hop over to the chat.
Amazing. I'm going to try and gracefully share my screen and see if this happens smoothly or not smoothly. Let's see. Go share. Go desktop 1. Okay. I believe I'm sharing my screen.
You are, don't worry.
Okay, fantastic. I was wondering, I was be like, Jenny. Amazing. So we are going to go over, this is going to be sort of the things that I've encountered through working with lots of different artists, like working with artists who are developing, artists who are a little bit higher up there. Like, I think that what I've noticed is that a lot of the same things come up, and there's a lot of reasons why communicating about sound is quite difficult, which we will get into. So yeah, this is just 7 things that are helpful to bear in mind when you're searching for a mixing engineer, working with a mixing engineer, all of that good stuff. So we're gonna start off, these are the 7 things. We're going to start off by talking about how we're all slightly different, how the role has kind of changed over time, and the implications that has for kind of modern day mixing. We're going to talk about how to find a mix engineer, how to choose your references and discuss references with an engineer, Then we're going to do a little bit of admin, a little bit of stemming. Also, it's good to know that we are here for you, and the ways that you can kind of take your foot off the pedal a little bit once your music is in safe, trusted hands. And then we're going to go over some things to bear in mind when you're listening to your first mix. You've got your first draft mix back from your engineer, and some little tips for giving feedback, and some of my favorite feedback that I've gotten from clients, because I love mix notes. I love learning the ways that different people express their ideas. Is really exciting to me. And then finally, we're just going to go over a few of the constraints that we are working to as mixers, and just some very, very, very gentle mix theory that's just good to bear in mind when you're giving feedback, listening to mixes, all of that. So to begin with, first thing you need to know is that we are all a little different, and it's helpful to know what mixing is. If you want to mix engineer, why do you want to mix engineer? Why would anybody want to mix engineer? Mixing in the past was quite well defined. In the days where things were all done on analog tape, usually in large format studios, things were quite clear cut. You'd kind of go, write, orchestrate, record, edit, mix, master, release. And due to the technology we were working with at the time, there wasn't much overlap necessarily between roles. It was kind of quite clear cut what everybody was doing. But the way people make music nowadays has changed quite a lot. And with the accessibility of audio gear, microphones, software, synthesizers, all of that, there can be a lot more interplay between different people. Something in a modern production might go back and forth between the writer and the producer a couple of times, or the producer and the mixer a couple of times. Things might even get changed after they've been released, because we have digital distribution now. So that all has implications for what modern mixers do, I feel. This means that there is some flexibility within the role, and that not every mixer is going to have the exact area of expertise. Some mixers that I know are also incredible orchestrators and producers, and they might be able to kind of give you a little bit of feedback on your production or some suggestions if that's what you want. At the same time, that might really not be what you want. You might be like, I've worked hard on this, I've perfected this production, do not touch it. I want you to just tidy up the edges, which is totally valid as well. There are no right or wrong answers. It's just good to have an awareness of what you're looking for. So a quick word on editing. I need to move this. Editing is often an overlooked part of the process. I don't know why this is, to be honest. I think part of it is because different people take responsibility for it in different situations. It might be the producer. If you're working with a producer, or you are a producer, you might be kind of tuning things, timing things, tweaking things, choosing takes, editing between takes. That might be something that you take responsibility for. It might, on the other hand, be something that you want from your mix engineer. The edit could also span a really wide range of different jobs. It could be a very quick tidy up and just making sure that you've crossfaded all of your edits between vocal takes, for instance, or it could be fully manually tuning, timing, editing every single instrument in the song and completely re-establishing the groove. The edit can make a massive, massive difference. I've definitely edited tunes before I've started mixing, and I've not put a single plugin in or touched a single fader, but the song sounds completely different when I'm just done getting everything locked into time, maybe to the grid a little bit, or maybe just changing the relationship between like the bass and the drums. Can give the song a completely different feel. Likewise, kind of timing backing vocals to be a little bit more in sync with each other, or horn sections is another one. They can sound like there's some mixing work already been done on them, just because they're hitting at the same time and they're just sounding that much stronger. So helpful to know what you want from an edit, whether you want any editing at all, and the kind of the degree that you're happy for somebody to go in and make edit decisions for you. You might want everything auto-tuned to oblivion. For pop, this is almost unavoidable if you're doing like proper Ariana Grande pop, pop, pop. It might be an expectation of your listeners that everything is going to be very, very gridded. Whereas if you're kind of working with jazz or classical music, you might want to show off your performance as it happened on the day and kind of stay true to that. One word I would say is that try not to compare yourself if you are in one of those spaces where you're, there's less noticeable processing going on in the music. Try not to compare yourself to other people in your genre. A lot of editing can be really transparent and subtle, and you might listen to a performance and think that that's exactly how it came out on the day. And actually there's a little bit of trickery, a little bit of tuning, a little bit of melodyne. So I guess what I mean by that is don't feel like you're limited if you're in one of those genres that's a little bit more acoustic, organic. Don't feel like you're not allowed to ask for editing or ask for tuning. Like, you're allowed to ask for whatever you need. So yeah, different mixers have different backgrounds. Some people are from more technical backgrounds, some are from more musical backgrounds. And it's really interesting. I asked some people on Instagram how they viewed their role as a mix engineer and how they explained it to other people. And the results I really loved because everyone was kind of describing the same job, but with a slightly different view on it. So let's go through some of the answers. My friend Ricky said, I amplify the artist's vision and the song's emotional content in a way that technically enhances it. So this feels quite balanced between he's honoring the emotion of a song, but he also views his role as technical, which it is. And it seems like he kind of views his role as a balance between the two, the creative and the technical. My friend Judah went for what I feel is quite a technical explanation, talking about stacking a bookshelf but in 3D. So there's height, width, and depth, and he's trying to find space in the bookshelf for all the books, or all the tracks, all the elements of your production. For a friend Will, who's an amazing multi-instrumentalist and a producer. He produces for Chloe Badour and Queen Colobus. He came up with colours in boxes, architecture, which is very vague and esoteric. And I really liked that. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what he means. But he looks at his role in that kind of more vague, vibes-based way, which I really love. My friend Grant, exact opposite. I do the volume. My friend Finley says it's like cooking, or perhaps like making a good stew. I think the cooking analogy is also really interesting for reasons that we will explore in a bit. So, in summary, mixing is traditionally, if we're going to go for like the most literal definition I can make, it's the process of balancing, panning, EQing, compressing, adding reverbs, adding effects, adding saturation, adding or taking things away, and making room for everything and making sure everything is balanced. Modern mixes may eke their way into other roles. I was trying to think of why the lines feel so blurry sometimes. And I think it's because even down to the kind of traditional mixing things like panning and the balance of things, that can be the producer's job really, or the mixer's job. And I know that I've had mixes through from people where I have very, very little to do because the producer actually has made most of those decisions already, doesn't want them touched. And then there's some people who want all of those decisions made. So again, just depends where you sit on that. So yeah, I think the first thing to know is what you want. And then find someone who can give you what you want and whose definition of what they do aligns with your definition of what you want them to do. I think it's actually probably quite an interesting and useful question to ask if you're considering working with someone is, how would you describe what you can do for me? and see if you resonate with what they come up with. So the second thing to know is that there are many of us. We are everywhere. There are so many different ways to find someone to mix your music, especially in the age of the internet, where you don't even need to meet someone in person. There's just so many of us and so many ways to find us. It can be very difficult. I think sometimes there's an information overload. It can be hard to narrow down who you want to work with your music. It's a big decision to make. So the first way that you might want to find somebody is by looking on social media. The pros of this is that you are already probably on social media. I spend an embarrassing amount of my time scrolling Instagram, and I've often found people that I want to work with totally by accident, just because I happen to have been scrolling at the time and something's caught my eye. Many people use their social media as their portfolio. I think lots of people have websites, but it's not a given that someone would have a website nowadays. I think a lot of people do just rely on their social media. And you just have an abundance of people at your fingertips. It's as easy as searching like hashtag mix engineer and then just like DMing a bunch of people. That can also be a con because it's a little bit overwhelming, and it's like that. I think there's a parable with like the donkey, and he's between two bales of hay and he can't decide which one to go to, and he just sits in the middle and gets really, really hungry. So sometimes I feel like that when I'm trying to look for maybe a mastering engineer or someone to work with on my music. It's just too much choice and it's hard to sort through it all. Also, bear in mind, if you're using Instagram, I don't have TikTok, so I couldn't tell you about TikTok. But the audio quality on Instagram is trash. It is so bad. It's to the point where I hear things I've mixed or songs that I really love and I know sound really good, and I just kind of cringe a little bit because the data compression they use is just, it doesn't represent the music well. So if you find someone on Instagram, definitely go on Spotify or Tidal or whatever and actually check out their output in a dedicated platform rather than just sticking to Instagram. And then the last thing is that a beautiful page doesn't equal a creative match. Someone can be very, very good at social media and not necessarily as good at mixing. The second way that you could find somebody is through looking at your credits list. So if there's a song that you really, really love, usually if you search AllMusic and Discogs are the main ones. I know there's also Jackster, which I think you have to sign up for. And then if you use Tidal to stream, you can also find any information that has been written about the credits, you'll be able to find on Tidal. So if the label haven't given you details, it won't come up. But if they have, then you'll be able to see who mixed, who mastered, who produced, all of that. This can be a really good way of finding someone where you know that you're likely to like their work and you know that they have experience in the kind of music that you enjoy. Especially on Tidal, it's really easy to find, once you've found like the person that mixed X song, you can click their name and then you get a whole list of their credits with like the biggest ones at the top, and then you can hit view all and see everything. And it can be a really fun way to discover music as well. I've definitely gone down the rabbit hole. There's a mixer called Neil H. Pogue who mixes a lot of Kamasi Washington stuff. And I just clicked on his name on Tidal, and then I saw that he mixed like loads of Doja Cat stuff as well. And I just went down a rabbit hole and like listened to everything he mixed, and I listened to some really cool music. So if you've got time to just go down and listen to a bunch of music, it can be really fun. The cons are that sometimes the credits information just isn't available, especially on independent releases. Sometimes people aren't super hot on their metadata. The other thing to bear in mind is, this might seem really obvious, but if you really love like Silk Sonic or Ariana Grande and you want the same person who mixed that to mix your song, you might need several £1,000s to be able to afford to hire them. You also don't necessarily know what they were working with to begin with, and you also don't know what the mastering engineer did. It might be that they started off with stems that sounded really good already, or their mix was good, but then the mastering engineer did a really, really solid master that really brought out the most exciting presentation of that song possible. And if you were to listen to just what the mix engineer did, you might not be quite so impressed. And then the last thing to bear in mind is, are you enjoying the mix or the song itself? It's really hard to tease apart what is a good production, what's good writing, and what's a good mix. Sometimes when I'm listening to something, I try and imagine that it was recorded on an iPhone and try and imagine myself still enjoying it to the same extent. And if I feel like I would still enjoy it to the same extent, then it's probably not the mix that I'm enjoying. It's probably the song. And then the last way that we'll talk about today is word of mouth. This is my favorite way to find people to work with, just because you can get a lot more information. If you have a friend that worked with a mix engineer and had a really good experience, you can ask for before and afters. So, you know, what state was it in when you sent it to them? What did they actually do? What did the mastering engineer do? And you can get information that's not just about the mix. You can get information like, how long did it take for them to turn around tracks? How did they respond to feedback? How open were they to working the way that you wanted to work? Were they nice? Were they polite? Not just the final product. And then I hesitate to even mention this, but we're in a cost of living crisis. So mates rates might be a thing. If it's a friend of a friend, if it's a friend of yours, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking more than once. Maybe there is something wrong, but if you ask once and they're down, that might be somewhere that you can save some money. The cons of this is that it does depend on who is in your circle. If you are an introvert like myself, it took me a while to kind of find a group of creatives that I kind of felt like were my people and my circle. So if you don't have that, then it might be difficult to kind of reach out to people and find mix engineers that people have enjoyed working with. And then also, I think that communication just becomes doubly as important when you're working, especially with friends of friends. If you're working with a friend and things are getting a little bit tense, you can kind of say like, hey, mate, come on, this isn't how I want it to be going. Whereas if you've kind of been introed by somebody, things can get a little bit awkward. So I think it's just definitely doubly important to make sure that your expectations are all on the table, all laid out. Let them know if you have a deadline, let them know if you have a budget, let them know if there's specific things that you want or don't want, just so that you're not having to have those conversations from a tense space. Honorable mentions. You might prefer to work with someone who is from a similar experience as you, which I've gone through phases where I have issues with kind of being seen as like a female mix engineer. But the truth is, I think that for a lot of female artists, like, there is something to be gained from working with a female team, and the same for marginalized ethnic groups, same for marginalized sexualities. I think that some shared experience can go a long way with communication. And especially if your music relates to your experience, which I think a lot of people's do, there is absolutely nothing wrong with having this preference, in my opinion. Shout out to 2% Rising, which Jenny runs with Katie Tavini, who is a fantastic mastering engineer. They have a directory of gender minority, technical and creative freelancers and professionals. And the Trans Creative Collective have the same thing for people on the under the trans umbrella. I think the Trans Creative Collective do also have cis people on their directory, kind of allies. But I'm sure if you get in touch and say you want to work with a trans creative, they will hook you up. So that's everything about finding your mix engineer that I can think of for now. So you found them and you're ready to work. So now it's time to get on the same page sonically. This is really difficult because there is no vocabulary really for sonic information. I think a lot of the things that we use, a lot of the words that we use to describe sound are actually words that we've borrowed from other senses. So I just tried to come up with as many as I could. Warm is a sensory, it's a touch thing. Sharp, punchy, woolly, muddy. bright and shiny and clear. These aren't words that were made for sound. They were words that were made for your sense of touch, your sense of sight, your sense of taste. I've not heard anyone refer to mixes through like a sense of smell, but I guess a mix could be pungent or I guess strong. But anyway, there's not really much vocabulary that we have in the English language that covers sound. If anybody in the chat speaks other languages, by the way, and has kind of sound specific vocabulary, please drop it in the chat. Like, I'd be so interested to know if Jenny, you can capture some, if any come up.
Sure thing.
But yeah, this is really the crux of what I think, at least in the English language, makes communicating about sound quite tough. So what I like to do, and what I think the most efficient way of doing this is to combine your language, your words that you've borrowed from other senses, with the sounds that you feel they fit with. So that is how I learned that my warm might feel different to your warm. I might listen to a piano and think it sounds warm and rich, and you might think that it sounds muddy and woolly. So this process of kind of listening to music together can really help me get in your ears and understand what you want, what you think sounds good. So at the beginning of a project, I will probably ask you, and I think many others will ask you, to make a playlist of all the references that you want us to listen to. If you can write a little bit about each song, e.g., I like this snare. I think it cracks through the mix really well, but I think this kick is a little bit flubby. Like, you can make up words. You can literally make up words. As long as we have something to relate it to, we're learning. The other thing I would say is it can be useful to distinguish between references that you like for the vibe and references where there is something specific that you really want to emulate. In my experience, these can be really, really different. I'm going to just talk through some references that I've been going over with a friend of mine that I am producing and mixing his album. He's kind of a jazz tenor saxophonist, and he's got a quintet. The vibe references are not jazz. They are, I guess, pop, alternate R&B, but definitely not in kind of a traditional jazz space. So I'm going to play some samples for you.
This is how heaven sounds at night. Take a vow to be down for life. Got you right in the candlelight. Blow it out, how I blow your mind. Go away, slowly, slowly, towards me. Don't ever ignore me. You'll be sorry.
So what my client really loved about the M.I.A music was mostly the vocal treatment. His project doesn't contain any vocals, but he really loved the way that her voice was treated, the detail, the brightness, and also just the overall presentation of the music, the way it was compressed, the way it was arranged. He liked the idea of presenting a jazz record in a more traditionally pop, modern kind of a way. So that told me a lot. I then came back to him with this song and I said, how do you feel about this as a reference?
Masochistic kisses are how I thrive.
So then he came back to me and he said, yes, again, love the vocals, love the clarity, the upfrontness and the amount of space that they take up. He also commented on the sound stage, the way everything was panned and, you know, really interesting in a stereo field kind of a way. and the way that there was kind of subtle reverbs and ambiences added to the real instruments that took them out of a jazz space and more into a pop space. That was really appealing to him. So I would say definitely don't feel restricted to references from within the genre you're working with. You might actually be able to communicate what you want better with references outside of your genre, especially if you span a few or you don't really feel like you fit into one particularly, which I feel like is all of us. You don't need to necessarily go for the conventions of the styles you're drawing from. You can choose when to lean in and when to do something different. And listening to some things that are outside of the genre you're working on can be a really nice way of just playing with expectations and flipping it a little bit. And then the last thing, like with my client, you don't necessarily have to say, you don't have to provide a sax as a sax reference. It can be a vocal as a sax reference. This was actually really helpful in my case, because when I was thinking about microphones, I was thinking, okay, the big hard-hitting vocal mics, the C800s, the ELAMs, the U47s, that's what we're going to go for, rather than a Coles or something really warm and ribbony and vintage. So these were really useful references. But I did also ask him for some more exact references. So here's what we came up with. What he loved about this was the drum sound most of all. This was the thing I listened to the most when I was trying to figure out where to sit the snare, because it's just a really weighty, meaty snare, lots of snare bottom, really good stuff. The first comment I had was, do you like the reverb? And he said no. And I said, okay, good to know. It's quite an obvious reverb. It shows itself to me. I know. And I wanted to make sure that I wanted to figure out whether that was something he wanted or not. Turns out something he didn't want. And then the sax sound, he was worried about being compared to Mark Turner because his tone is very similar. So this is almost an anti-reference for his saxophone sound. It's a starting point, and we know that that's an acceptable sound to go for. But I also know from the previous references that he's trying to do something a little bit different. Another reference came from the bassist in his band, actually. And this is a much more modern presentation of something in the jazz genre. This is what this one sounds like. So when I sent this to the saxophonist, the band leader, he agreed with the bassist. He said, this is beautiful. This is a really good, modern, full sounding jazz record. This is actually one of my favorite jazz records now. Really, really good. But when we were listening to the drums, we felt like the Mark Turner actually had a little bit of an edge, especially when it came to the snare. It was just hitting in a way that this one didn't. But also the instrumental balance on this felt fuller. I mean, you'll notice it's much louder. But, you know, the piano, for instance, takes up quite a lot of space, which I think in this case is a good thing. So taking all of this into account, I'm going to play you a little bit of the work in progress. Now, I wish I had some sax for you to hear. Oh, I have a slide, actually. I have a slide I didn't know I had. But yeah, for these exact references, this is where your sensory descriptors are really, really helpful, because we get to know what a weighty, meaty, snappy snare sounds like to you. And the things that you don't want are as useful as the things that you want. If there's an anti-reference, something that you really want us to stay away from, send it to us, especially, again, if it's something that's part of the genre that you're in, but you hate it, send it to us and be like, just don't make me sound like this. That's incredibly useful for us, and it'll help us not horrify you. The one thing to bear in mind, yes, this is good that I remembered this, especially when you're working with things like jazz and classical, the recording sometimes does have a little bit more of a bearing on the sound than it might do with like a pop or an electronic genre. There's a lot you can do with like sample replacement on kicks and snares in pop music that some subgenres of jazz just have less of a tolerance for. So I would say if you're working with any recording engineers in the process that you're making your music, all of these conversations we're having with the mixer, have with them too, if you can. It'll just make sure that everyone's on the same page throughout. This is what we can't do. We can wash your car, but we can't turn it into a Ferrari, unfortunately. Also, shout out Jules for finding this meme for me. I was desperate to find this exact meme, and I searched and searched and I couldn't find it. Yeah, cool. Anyway, here's the project as it stands. I wish I could show you the saxophone. My friend sadly got COVID when he was supposed to be doing his sax takes and hasn't managed to get to it yet, but I can play you everything but the sax and listen to the drums. I think that the drums, that talk about references was really useful, and I hopefully you'll be able to hear what I mean. So, yes, I think that there's something from each reference in here. Obviously, if we had the saxophone, you'd be able to hear a bit more of the Janae Aiko. Sadly, we don't have that yet, but you can hear the snare. On the day with the drummer, we were kind of doing a lot of experimenting with wallets, with tea towels, with different snares. We ended up with a Ludwig Supraphonic 400, if that means anything to anybody. And I feel that was successful. We also ended up completely swapping out the acoustic bass on this one for a synth sub that just kind of drones throughout and follows the harmony, just to again take it out of that conventional jazz space. The Rhodes, we put through some really wonky tape and kind of played with the varispeed just to add some more interest and something extra that wasn't completely organic. And with the piano, we kind of tried to let the piano take up a lot of space, especially in the low mids. So I think you can hear the logic and the train of thought, which is why this is really worth doing. I think I would have approached this music very differently if we hadn't had those conversations. So this is why we love references. Quickly, we're going to talk about vintage references because they are great to communicate a vibe. However, they might not sound how you remember them sounding. I think that what happens is we remember vintage songs through the lens of how we experience modern music. So we kind of have songs in our heads, we have Stevie Wonder in our heads, but we imagine it as if it was Silk Sonic, like something from last year sometimes. And it can be a little bit of a shock to actually listen to these songs and realize that actually the presentation, while it's amazingly mixed and amazingly produced, it doesn't necessarily work in a modern context. So as an example, here are some samples, some references that I got sent while we were working on the All Day Breakfast Cafe project, which is a disco band. start with some Quincy Jones. Just having a party by myself in my room. Oh my goodness. And then the last one we listened to was some Stevie Wonder. So these are all bangers. However, what we found during the process is that I was kind of chasing these sounds and it wasn't hitting. And we weren't figuring out exactly why it wasn't hitting until we realized that a lot of these references, again, like we were talking about earlier, it was just songs that we loved and not necessarily mixes that we felt worked for this project. I'll head back and we'll have a listen again, but certain features of this mix, these mixes, especially the Quincy and the Stevie, we'll go back and listen again because the kick and the snare, and in the Stevie Wonder, all of the drums actually all feel very similar. There's not much differentiation between the kick and the snare, whereas in the modern revival of disco and the Dua Lipa stuff, for instance, and even in the new Beyonce stuff, the kick and the snare are really differentiated, and you can hear, you know, the snare is much higher up in the spectrum and the kick is usually a lot lower and subbier. So let's go back and have a listen again. I'm just going to play a little bit so you can hear these kicks and snares. So there you can kind of hear the kick is very clicky. There's a lot of like presence in that kick, and then the snare kind of the same space, and then the Stevie Wonder even more so. And especially when you get to the toms, right? Like the toms and the kick and the snares, very little difference between them. The Kiki guy, which I won't go back and play because I'm struggling with PowerPoint. It's probably the most useful reference here. If you can remember back to this one with the disco horns, that really killing horn line. It's very saturated. It sounds like it's been through lots and lots of old tape. And in that sense, it sounds very vintage. But in terms of presentation, where things are sitting in the spectrum, the kick and the snare are much more differentiated. There's a lot more of the bottom of the snare, the actual snares themselves. And this kind of helps it feel a little bit more exciting in a modern context. Another thing that we did was we listened to some modern vintage mixes. Now, I'm going to play a phenomenal mix next to my passing mix. So prepare. But we use the vintage stuff as like one end of the spectrum. We use the strata stuff I'm about to play as the other end of the spectrum. And then we decided we want it to be somewhere in the middle. So that's what this is. But this is a phenomenal bit of mixing. Like, feel free to use this as a reference whenever you want. It's very, very well mixed and well recorded. So yeah, I think that's a much more modern presentation. It's a lot louder than a lot of the 70s stuff and the 80s stuff. And it's a little bit closer to where we wanted to fit All Day Breakfast Cafe in. So here's what we ended up with for Sugartown Parade.
You've got to, 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 you've got to get on down to the Sugartown Parade. Sugartown.
So you can hear there, we're kind of going for vintage in terms of the horns especially, and less kind of synth heavy than the strata. So it's going to sound a little different. But with the kick and the snare, we're definitely trying to keep those in separate places, which seems to be the more modern way of doing disco. So in summary, that was a long section. They're not all going to be this long. But references really are one of the most important parts of communication for me when I'm working, especially with a new artist. It's the most powerful way for me to get on your level, get in your ears, understand how you experience other people's music, and so understand how you experience your own music. I like to do this through a mixture of vibes-based references and more literal references where we're really actually seeking to emulate rather than just catch a vibe. Consider sharing your references with everyone you work with, not just your mixing engineer. A recurring theme of this seminar is going to be all the things you'd think about for a mix, think about from the start, because that's how these creative processes for me have been the most successful, is when we're keeping in mind mixed principles during the production, during the recording. It all really, really helps. So yeah, have all these reference conversations with producers and recording engineers and anybody else that you meet with before the mixer. And then, yeah, just make sure you listen to something before you send it off as a reference. You might be tempted to just kind of throw out like, oh, I love like John Bonham, Led Zeppelin drums. I mean, so do I. They sound great, but they might not sound how you remember them sounding. So just check. It might be what you want, but it might also not be what you want. So we're on to the next section. I'm going to try and do this quickly because this is very admin heavy. When you've chosen somebody to work with, you've had your initial conversations, you feel like you're on the same page and you're ready to send them your song, it's time to stem it out. This doesn't have to be traumatic, but it can be tough. The general rules of stemming. I'm not going to go into how to do stems in every single door because I don't have experience with all of them. I think Pro Tools is probably one of the most complicated. You just have to kind of hit solo on each track, make sure it's not sending to anything, and then bounce, and then just do that repeatedly. I feel like that would work for most doors. But beyond that, some general rules for stemming out your mix. Export in the same bitrate and sample rate as you recorded in. If you recorded in 24 bits, 48 kilohertz, for instance, bounce it in 2448. Don't bounce it in 96. It's not going to do anything. You're going to make the file twice as big. It's going to take twice as long to upload. And it's not going to be any higher quality. You might feel like because it's 96K, it's shiny, but you're not adding any new information. You're literally just adding a bunch of zeros. So yeah, try and avoid that one. Make sure your stems all start from the same place, from the beginning of this track They don't necessarily have to end at the end if they drop out before then. They do have to start at the beginning, even if the part that you're stemming out doesn't come in until like the middle 8 or the last chorus. If we don't know that and we just get like a 30-second clip and a 3-minute clip, we don't know where anything is in relation to anything else. So everything's starting at the same place. Check all your edits through. Wherever a clip starts or ends or crosses over into another clip, if you've got like different takes crossing over into each other, make sure there's a little crossfade there. If you don't, we're going to get clicks and pops, especially in bass and things with low frequency information in them. And they're not impossible to remove, but they're very difficult and you don't always get the best results. So I would always go back to a client if they'd send me a stem with clicks and pops in and ask them to put some crossfades in. So it's definitely good to get it right from the start. I would also say, even if you're not confident in your mixing skills, export a reference mix, export the whole thing as you've been listening to it, because it's another piece of information for us. And there might be some good information about, you know, where you want things panned, where you want things level wise, which parts are important in different places. Even if you're not super confident with the overall presentation of it and the overall sound of it, doesn't matter. It's really good for us to have. And then also try and address production snags before you send your stems. If you're thinking, oh, that'll get fixed in the mix, try not to think that. I do the same thing. I used to definitely send off mixes and be like, oh, this will probably be fixed in the master. But it's better to just not assume that anything is going to get fixed in the next process. If you can send something off in the best state possible for you, then that means that the next person can do their best work, and then the next person can do their best work. So if there's a part that you're not quite feeling just yet, I think it really is worth taking that extra time. Even if you need to take an extra day, people will be understanding. Just make sure that it's how you want it to be before you send it off to mix. These aren't rules, but these are kind of good things to bear in mind. Try to give us everything dry. Try to take off compression, EQ, corrective autotune. If you've got autotune that's there for like creative reasons, yeah, sure, like I'm totally game, leave it on. But if you're trying to make sure that we never hear you sing a bomb note, we've had plenty of bomb notes and it doesn't faze us, and we are not going to judge you, and we are not going to judge your voice. What we want is the rawest material possible, so that, you know, if you do want us to tune it, we can go in and do a little manual tune and find something that's nice and transparent and still feels in tune and accurate for you. But if you send us something with autotune, we can't make it, we can't bring it back from there. We can't make it sound more natural. So I know I always cringe when I have to send people vocals. Sometimes I do a little bit of vocal arranging, but it's really fine and no one's going to laugh at you. The next thing, try and give us everything individually. If you've got drum recordings, like live drum recordings, rather than giving us just drums or giving us kick, snare, hat, toms, give us kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom. It's long, again, it is really long, but it just gives us the most control. So if we hear like a little frequency in the kick that we don't like, we can notch that out and not affect the rest of the drum kit. This kind of applies for everything: horn sections, synths, vocals, whatever. Smallest possible stem. If you use an effect that you really love, one thing I really love to get from clients is 100% wet and 100% dry. So if you've got like a reverb plugin on your track, like as an insert, turn the mix knob all the way to 100, bounce it, turn it all the way to 0, bounce it. And if you've got the reverb or the effect coming in as a return, just make sure that you export the dry and just the return, not the mix of the dry and the return. If you can give us that, it means that we have control over each element, so we can still use that effect that you really love. But if there's something in the dry signal that we want to tweak, we can tweak it without affecting your effects. We want the most control possible so that we can kind of do our best work. If there's inline processing, like inserts that are really, really vital to a stem, say you've got like a really heavily distorted vocal sample, leave it in, let us know that it's vital. Consider giving us a dry. Sometimes I've had somebody say like, oh, I've got this sample that's really, really important. And I know the plugin that they use because I can hear it and I go, oh, I have that plugin. Can you just give me the dry, and then I can recreate it on my side. Again, I'm not going to like go changing something drastically, but it means that I have control. If I want to EQ out a frequency that's bugging me, I can do that without affecting the processing, if that makes sense. But it's not essential. You don't have to. You can just send us the affected stem and just say like, this is what I want, and we can work with that. And then some small things that are little wonderful things for us to receive. Key and beats per minute. This probably saves us all of 5 minutes, but when you're getting going with a project, it can really, really make a difference. Just means that we can get all of our effects, all of our tune stuff, all working in the right key, all in time with everything. Please name your audio files and check that the things are what they're named as. I think in Logic, a lot of things bounce as audio bip. And when you get like a folder that is like 100 audio bips, it's quite overwhelming, and it takes a little bit of time to get our heads around. And it just means that we might not be able to get a first draft back to you as quickly as we'd like. I would say when you're doing stems, it's one of those things where it's boring, but you need to focus, which is the hardest stuff to do. If it's boring, but you can zone out, it's fine. If it's boring, but you have to focus, it becomes intense. So what I do now when I'm stemming out for like remixes, or even if I'm getting something of my own mix, I write a list of every single stem that I'm expecting to send. And then I go through, and as I'm stemming, I tick them off like a physical piece of paper. And I listen back to them in like Finder just to make sure that they're exactly what I'm expecting. Yeah, these checks are really important. Some other kind of miscellaneous things, if you're using Dropbox and it's syncing with your session folder and you're just doing work and then letting it sync, and then someone else is using that Dropbox. Don't turn your computer off once you've stopped working on it. I've had it in the past where I've been booked to mix on a certain day. The producer has been up really late. They finished their production. They've been like, yes, I made my deadline. Shut down laptop, go to bed. I wake up in the morning and the Dropbox is empty because nothing has uploaded, nothing is synced. Try and avoid those things. So number 5, we've made it through stemming. It's in my hands, or it's in somebody else's hands. It's not your problem anymore. You deserve a beer or a tea or a celebratory beverage, and you deserve to put your feet up. You've done it. Well done. Try not to listen to the song anymore. This is something that I've recently been doing with artists that I work with, and I think it's so helpful for a few reasons. One is that the primacy effect is a thing. This is the bias where basically the first piece of information your brain receives, it holds onto. It's like why if you read a headline that's wrong, you're more likely to remember the headline than you are to remember the correction that comes along later. And I think it applies to mixing as well, and it applies to working on music, because your first idea of a song is going to get lodged in your brain as the strongest one, and it's not necessarily the one that you want to be the strongest one, because we're going to come along and change it. It's what you want us to do. You're also fighting against familiarity bias, which is the way our brains keep us safe is to like familiar things, and if you make your demo mix too familiar, anything else is going to sound a little bit wrong and a little bit dangerous. And then the last thing is that you're done and you don't want to be listening back to your production and going, should I have put that there? Did I need that vocal there? Did I need that? I do it with mixes all the time. Once I send it off to mastering, I have to stop listening to it until the master comes back, because I will pick it apart. I think, we're here to make your life easier. We're here to help you. And this is a really good opportunity to get some distance from your music. The whole process can be quite intense. So this is what I recommend. It's not an absolute must, but it's been working really well for me and my artists. So you get your mix back. Sometimes we've nailed it, and then no more needs to be done. You say, thank you so much, send it off to mastering, off you go. I think that, in my experience, has been relatively rare. There will often, there'll usually be some things that you want changed. But think of the first mix as a first draft. You know, you don't need to panic. If there's anything that you're not feeling, it's all good. It's really all good. Nothing is permanent. Pro Tools has a back button. It's all going to be okay. The feedbacks on the first mix is such a valuable thing for me because, you know, up until this point, we've been talking about your music through other people's music. Now we get to talk about your music using your music. I get to see if I've got the right idea from all of this stuff. And if I haven't, that's also really valuable information because I can course correct. You know, we can update this model in our head that might not be completely accurate. So when you're listening to your music for the first time, you've got your first mix back. I would say choose for the first listen at least the best system you have available to you. So if you have a really good pair of stereo speakers or a really nice pair of like over-ear headphones, those are the ideal. If not, just like whatever you have that is the best thing that you have access to. I would start the listening session not with your song. I'd start it with your references or just some songs that you know really, really well that you're really familiar with. Once you've tuned your ears and you're ready and you're feeling, you know, ready to hear this mix, a little bit more relaxed maybe, get a physical notebook or your notes app. And as you're listening, just note down everything you notice, good and bad. You know, vocal in a little bit loud, really like drums. Where did that horn line go? All of this stuff, just really, really rough. Just get it all out. Listen 2 or 3 times. And then once you've got a little list of notes and you kind of feel like you've got your head around how it sounds, then I would take it to some other systems. It's good to listen around a few different things. I was looking for a photo of just anyone wearing headphones, and I absolutely fell in love with this grandpa. Like, I really want him to be my grandpa. He looks like he's so into that music, so into it. It's beautiful. So we start with headphones. Things to bear in mind about headphones are that they will not have quite as much bass extension. They will have enough for you to tell that everything's balanced, unless they're like the ones that you get at Boots checkout that are like £5. But if they're not that, then you should be able to hear some bass. So if you're not hearing any bass, it's worth mentioning to your engineer that it's not feeling balanced, but you might lose some sub. The other thing is that a lot of the information that we get from sound in nature that helps us determine where it is in space, it comes from the reflections of our shoulders, of our chests, off like the little squiggly curly bits of our ears, of our hair. And when you use, especially when you use earbuds, like in-ears, you axe all of that out. And usually the way your brain responds is to go, this is all inside my brain, which can be a really cool effect. And you can actually use it. I think a lot of Tame Impala stuff for me is headphone music because I want to feel it inside my head. But just be aware that that's an effect. You know, the stereo image, you're going to experience it slightly differently to how you want on speakers. Another thing you can do is take it to the street, listen in some noisy settings, listen as background noise, and you might notice some different things. Sometimes when I'm checking a mix, I'll go out of the room and do something else, and I just notice different things. So that can be a useful thing to do. This is my car, everybody. Listening in the car. Here's what you need to bear in mind. Stereo image is not going to be the one. Cars are designed to kind of give an okay listening experience in every seat in the car. There is no sweet spot, but there is also no stereo image. You know, you've got drivers here, there, and everywhere. You've got speakers here, there, and everywhere. So I would not make any notes on stereo image while you're listening in the car, if you can help it. Bass will also feel very different depending on whether you are stationary with the engine off, idle with the engine on, or driving. And then even then, different kinds of road will mask the sound in different ways. So if you want to judge like the overall balance of things, I would say the best way to judge it would be engine off, stationary. Just don't drain your battery. Make sure it's turning on again afterwards. And then again, just like kind of, you know, listening on the bus, going for a drive can be a really good way to experience your music in a different way, and you might pick up some different things. Third one, mix engineers hate her. I think that listening on your phone to your mixes is an incredibly valid thing to do. I think it's totally fair enough. Especially a lot of people are unfortunately going to be listening on their phone speakers. So it's natural to make sure that it's coming across the way you want it to. Just understand that it's not the full representation. It's not the most accurate representation. And avoid making any notes on bass or stereo image, because there's just no way of telling. It's not an accurate enough playback system for that to be useful information to you. Consider comparing your references with your mixes on every single system. So every time you listen on a new system, listen to your references, tune your ears, ground yourself. Give extra attention to whichever mode, after you've done your kind of initial listen on your nice high quality, whatever you have, give most attention to the thing that you're actually imagining your listeners are going to do. If you're imagining your listeners are going to be listening on the train or listening in the car, give some attention to that. Make sure it's the experience that you want your fans and your listeners to have. Finally, your mix might not be as loud as Spotify just yet, so you might kind of hear or notice a level jump. What I do to combat this usually is I'll send a mix, a listen copy, which is just, I've put a limiter right on the end. I've got it as loud as I can without the limiter kind of having really obvious effects. And it just helps these mixes, while we're still in this tweak stage, compete with the references that you're listening to, so that you're not having to kind of turn things up and down and up and down. If it's important to you to have something that is a decent level of loudness, request a listen copy. You can always get back in touch and say, hey, loving the mix, but I'm struggling to kind of compare it with my references. Can you just pop a limiter on it for me and get me an extra few dB out of it? Most people should be happy to oblige. Similarly, if you don't want a limiter on it, if you want it taken off, you can ask for that too, and we'll be happy to do that for you. So then once you've listened in all these different places, it's time to give your notes. So just like when you're talking about references, use whatever sensory language comes naturally to you. Make up words, use words that people use to describe cake or sunsets, whatever it is, whatever comes to you is great. If there's something that we've not nailed and you have a reference for it, send us a reference. It's not too late. There's never too many references. And don't worry necessarily about being precise. But if you want to be precise, if you feel like you know exactly what it is that's bugging you, tell us. Even if it's wrong, like, it's still useful information. I had a mix once where someone told me they wanted the compressor on the piano to have a slower attack. Now, I didn't have a compressor on that piano. It was totally uncompressed. But what I got from that was that it wasn't coming through enough for them. It wasn't cutting. And so what I ended up doing was just boosting the kind of presence area of it a little bit with some EQ. And that had the right effect. And, that was a successful mix note, even though I didn't end up taking it literally. So yeah, basically anything is good. We're going to go through, my friend Jelly has a song called Black Line, which is great. It's a climate rage banger. So I'm going to play you kind of the intro, and I'm not going to read this out, but here, this is the first mix note that I got back from her was this.
Black line run from the belly of a gun. Black line spread.
So my favorite notes, possibly one of my favorite mix notes, second only to the next one, which we'll see in a minute, is when it works when everything's in the track, but when it's exposed, it sounds too much like I'm in a cave of high frequency bats. It's not the cave that's high frequency, it's literally the bats. That made me, we were both very sleep deprived. That made me howl, made me cackle. I loved it. But yeah, this is really good language, warmer, bluesy vintage sound. less of that nasty modern sounding distortion, more warm and yummy. So that to me translated as not so much HF, not so much brightness, a little bit more body richness, low mids, and roll back on that ridiculous reverb. So here was version 2.
Black line run from the belly of a gun. Black line spread.
So we lost the doom in this one. It's very sad to hear. And it took me a while I panicked a little bit when I saw that. We didn't have very long to get the doom back. But she did give me some really good information. She said, she thinks the doom is coming from the cave of high frequency bats. So that lets me know I've rolled out the reverb a little bit too much. And, she told me exactly what she needed. She needed it automated out when the drums were more exposed and back in when the mix was kind of cooking and a little bit more full. We also got, she really set the scene for me with this black and white film about how mankind has destroyed the world set in Mississippi. The way I interpreted this is I need to roll off even more of that guitar distortion. And then her vocal being gravelly like Tom Waits. I wasn't sure what to do with this. What I ended up doing was kind of automating the distortion so that it was always just on the brink of that really crazy overdrive. And that seemed to have the right effect. Especially if I'm working with long-term clients, and me and Jelly have worked together for a few years. These notes personally don't faze me, even if they're not specific. It's a cumulative process. This process of mixing this song with her, I got a little bit more in her ears and a little bit more able to experience music the same way as her. And this was a huge part of that. These notes, these very descriptive, esoteric, almost like metaphorical notes, super, super, super helpful. More doom and danger, yeah. This is what we ended up with. So this isn't mastered, but this is what got sent to master.
Black line run from the belly of a gun. Black line spread.
So a lot of these changes can feel kind of subtle. And one thing that I actually learned through this process was to tweak more than I thought I needed to. I ended up, I'd kind of roll off a little bit of something and change a little bit, and Jelly would be like, nah, more babes. So we ended up doing a final attended session on this, and that's how we finished off the mix. Is we sat in this very room actually together and we worked on it together. And there's pros and cons to working this way. I just wanted to go through them super quickly. The pros are it's a super fast way to work. It can be really, really productive because, you're both there with a purpose. You're only going to be, doing this attended mix for a set amount of time. It can really, really focus you. The feedback is instant. She might say, oh, I want to try this thing. I go, okay, what do you think of that? Oh no, actually I'm wrong. Can we try that thing instead? It's a lot quicker than sending versions back and forth, exporting stuff, and then waiting for the email back. And then also you can listen on the same speakers, which is huge. You're experiencing the music in the closest way to each other that you could, really, without having the other person's ears. So I do think there's a lot of value in attended mix sessions. The issues are that there's more organization required. You have to find a day where you're both free, which can be really tough in London freelancer world. And a lot of the early mixing is not a spectator sport. It's quite boring to watch. It's a lot of high parts filtering and, really listening in and trying to find that ring and what frequency is that. So I would recommend attended mixes to be something that you do later in the process, if at all. And then the other thing is that, if you're making incremental changes with someone, you're not listening to version 2 against version 3 and comparing the two. You're comparing lots of really tiny little changes and you can start to get a little bit lost. I now combat this. I will have the old version of the mix in my session on mute, and periodically we'll go between the two and we'll go, okay, where is this actually sitting compared to how we had it before? Otherwise, you can find yourself kind of pumping in loads and loads of, you can get fixated on something, like, oh, I want more low mids in this guitar. And then you just pump in more and more and more as you get used to it, which can be counterproductive. The final thing to say about attended mixing is that not everybody offers it. There are lots of reasons why someone might not offer attended mixing. It might be that they don't have a space that can cater for another person. It might also be a safety concern. I think some people have had bad experiences with attended mixes, attended masters, and I think it's important to, if it's something that's very important to you, definitely let that be known to your engineer. But then if they say that they don't offer attended mixing, treat that as a hard boundary and decide whether you want to proceed with this person or whether you want to find somebody who is willing to offer that to you. Okay, so in summary, we want to listen across several playback systems and we want to start with the best one and then move on to all the other ones that we're imagining our listeners are going to be using. We want to be aware of, the setting for a particular song, whether it's a headphone song or a car song or a morning commute song. Don't be afraid to introduce more references at any stage if something isn't coming back how you imagined, and use the language that feels natural to you, and you can be as precise or as metaphorical and esoteric as you like. Lastly, you are the expert on your own music. If you are getting resistance from your mix engineer, I definitely in the past have let my ego get in the way. I want to release a mix that other mix engineers are going to hear and go, oh, wow, she's so good. But that's not even important. What's important is that your music sounds the way that it's supposed to for you. So if someone scooped out a bunch of the warmth and the richness from your track and you want it back, you can tell them that you want it back. You have the last word. You are the most important person in this whole process. So finally, we're just going to quickly go over some of the constraints that mix engineers have to deal with. This is going to have some very light mix theory. Hopefully we're not going to go too deep. It's not going to be too confusing. So mixing is like positioning things in a 3D space, and our job is to make sure that everything has its own space and we're filling the space in the way that we want to. I wrote as much of the space as filled as possible. I think I might revise that and just say that we're filling the space intentionally. It's a pretty big space and we can do an infinite number of things within it. We can't put things outside the space and we can't make the space bigger. Every song has the same bandwidth. It has the same, you can cram the same amount of stuff into it. So what I want to do is kind of give two modern mixes that use the mix space in really, really different ways. So these are both mixes I love. I am not ranking them against each other. I'm just using them to kind of demonstrate the point that things can fill the space differently, and a lot of that is production as well. So this is reggaeton legend J Balvin.
Esto no es misa, pero vine de blanco. Hago solo éxito, a lo venir blanco. No puedo parar, si paro me estanco. Sobre prosperidad, solo sabe el banco. Madre, Medellín, pelo sí que tenga que pedir, de seguir, me cambie, de cari, María, no sé si lo ven, for real. Madre, Medellín, pelo sí que tenga.
So you can hear in this, there's like 4 things going on. There's the beat, one vocal, couple of little ad-libs, an 808 and a little synth. And that's it. So there's so much space, there's a lot of ambience, there's a lot of reverbs going on on the ad-libs and on that little synthy guy. In fact, that's only where the reverb's coming from. The percussion and the bass and the vocal is quite dry, the lead vocal. So there's so much space for everything to breathe. This mix to me feels like, you know, when you have a lens that has a really, I think it's a short depth of field where like the thing in the foreground is really, really focused, and then everything else is kind of really nice and blurred and has a real sense of depth. That's what this production and this mix gives for me. And then in contrast, we have the new Gorillaz record, which I'm obsessed with. This is the exact opposite to me. This is a very chaotic and dense arrangement. Let's listen to it now.
Never truth is all and it's sadness I consume. I drank too right into my formats every day. I drank too right. In the end I had to pay. Forever cold. In the end I had to pay. Forever cold. In the end I'll be okay. Forever cold.
Totally different approach to the production, which means that there's a totally different approach to the mix. I would say even with the production being so dense, everything, especially kind of along the timeline, everything really has its own space. So like those little fuzzy synths that come in, they come in between the kick and the snare. It's like kick, synth, snare. And then those little disco guitars, same again, they're kind of filling the gaps. Damon Albarn's vocal is on the beat, and then Thundercats is kind of on the offbeat, and Pan super wide. So they've been very intentional with filling the space, but they have filled it like it is full. Which means that in the mix, it's got some heavier limiting and some heavier compression just to fit everything in there and get it loud. I think if you were to try and take the J Balvin approach with this tune, it would end up being a lot quieter and maybe would lack energy. Having the compression and making sure everything is just nice and loud, even though there's so much going on, you're kind of sacrificing breathing room for excitement, if that makes any sense. This is how I read these mixes. You might experience them totally differently. But yeah, this one feels like a kind of those telephoto lenses where you can get everything in focus, but the picture that you're looking at is kind of, you know, very chaotic. You can see everything. So I use these examples to say you are constrained by the production. You kind of have to treat the productions as what they are. And there's different philosophies, but you know, you treat different productions differently. And the arrangement and the production that you give us is going to inform what we can do in the mix. You know, if you've given us a track with 4 parts, we can give each part 25% of the space. But if you give us a track with 100 parts, then we can give each part 1% of the space. So each individual part, you're not going to get them sounding as big, but it's a trade-off. You know, this is when you work with constraints, you have to find creative ways around things, which can be really fun. But again, you're starting this process of filling the space with the production, the writing. It influences the mix, so you're in a way already making mixed decisions, which is cool. And this is why I think a lot of producers are incredible mix engineers, because it's kind of 2 sides of the same coin. So some other things to watch out for. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'm just gonna drop some mix concepts very quickly. The first thing is phase. You might hear a mixer say, I'm not going to do that because it's going to make it phasey. And you might be like, what? And phase basically refers to the ways that waves interact with each other and add and cancel. If you have 2 waves, one's going like that, one's going like that, and you sum them, it makes 0. A lot of stereoizer plugins, stereo spreaders will often mess with phase to make things sound super, like unnaturally wide, like wider than you can get just by panning. Often what they're doing is they're kind of manipulating the phase, flipping the phase on the right hand side so that the right and the left sound completely different, and your brain gets a bit confused and goes, it's everywhere, which is a super cool effect. Love a stereo spreader. I use them extensively. They don't sound amazing on everything. If you're imagining that you're going to do a vinyl run, and that's a really important element of your release, or things are going to go out on radio, and some people are still using mono radios, you know, your super stereo phase inverted left and right are going to sum together in the middle and sound like nothing. They are going to disappear. So that's a consideration that we're working with. And if you hear somebody say, I'm not sure it's a good idea for us to use that plugin on that thing, that might be why. And then the other thing that I just want to address really, really quickly is the concept of masking. This is something that it's the thing that keeps you busy as a mix engineer for decades, because it's such a simple concept, but there's so much to it. It's basically, our ears can only process so much of one frequency at once. And even if you pile sounds on top of each other, they're going to start sounding quieter. It's the reason why when you get on, you know, the tube, you know, the bit of the central line that goes through Notting Hill, and it's like blisteringly loud. And if you're listening to music on that bit of the tube, your music sounds really quiet, and it's no quieter. Like, it's the same level, it's pumping out the same air pressure as it was, but your brain is perceiving it differently because there's this other noise that is overwhelming it. This is what can happen in mixes. Often if you get a mix back and you feel like, I just want everything up, and even, you know, you're even turning up the volume on your playback system and it's just all still sounding small, it's probably because things are masked. So that is the approach then, is to go through, okay, what is fighting? This should be something that your mix engineer is taking care of for you. But, you know, people miss things sometimes, and sometimes it can be more helpful to think about what's masking what when you feed back, rather than just saying, I want the drums up and the guitar up and the vocals up and the bass up and the horns up and the synths up. There's less that we can do then, because we, you know, again, we can't make that space any bigger. So we've made it to the end. In summary, there's lots and lots of ways to mix a song, but there are a couple of constraints that we must work to. And cheating around these constraints with phase manipulation to get the stereo image wider, to get the box wider, or heavy limiting and compression to get the box to stuff more things in the space, in the box. It has its trade-offs, and you don't want to rely too heavily on these things. The last thing that I would want to kind of leave you with is to consider that the mix kind of almost doesn't start at the mixing process. It starts with the writing and the production. When you're making writing decisions and production decisions, you're filling the space. You're doing the same thing that we are, but instead of doing it through EQs and compressors and effects and whatnot, you're doing it with arrangement and parts and vocals and backing vocals and all of that. And let that give you some confidence as well, that you already know how to fill a space. Like, you're doing it all the time, whether you realize it or not. You're doing exactly what mixers do with different tools. And hopefully this has given you even more tools so that you can communicate with another person, get them on the same level as you, and get the mixes that you want in return. That is everything. Thank you very much. And we made it with 3 minutes to spare.
Well done, Jess. That was amazing.
Yeah. Talking very
Yay!
fast at the end. I hope that was
No, it was great. It was great. Thank you so much. That was fab. If you are happy to close your screen sharing,
yes,
I will get you some questions. So I've dropped a prompt in the chat for people to drop questions if they have them. Obviously there's a little bit of a lag, so I'm going to start asking mine, and then as and when questions appear in the chat, I shall add them to the list. So my first question was actually take a breath. I was going to say maybe have a sip of tea. So do you have any tips for artists and producers that you didn't manage to wedge into this presentation? Was there anything you didn't manage to touch on? You did quite a lot here.
I hope it was I just feel like I just dumped my brain. I think, I don't know if there's any extra ones. I think the ones that I would really want to drive home is that you're the expert on your music, and that the mix process kind of doesn't start only at the mix. starts early. And if you can kind of make sure that each stage of the process is exactly how you want it before moving on, I feel like that's how the best finished products come about, when everyone isn't kind of waiting for someone else to fix it for them.
Okay, very good. All right, brilliant. Actually, we just had one that popped up on the stream. So Greg would like to know if you have any opinion on Kilohertz disperser plugin.
Oh, I don't, I'm not familiar with that plugin. I guess that sounds like another stereoizer kind of
Okay.
situation. You know what I could do is I could Google it. Oh, my night shift just switched on. I could look at it and then we can come back to that and I can talk about
yeah, that sounds good.
It was the Kilohertz disperser plugin.
Kilohertz disperser plugin.
Okay, I'm looking it up now. This might be a recommendation. I might end up using this.
I mean, you never know. One of the joys of doing these kinds of events is that sometimes you end up walking away with tips yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It smears high energy transients through space and time.
Oh.
Different take on transient shaping. So is this a little kind of phase aligner slash? I'm trying to figure out what this plugin does before I comment on it. I would say, I think that these kind of, I've heard them called black box plugins, where you kind of put something in and then something comes out. They kind of either work or they don't. Like, I feel the same way about Golfos sometimes. You know, there's that one that is kind of like a really, really fast dynamic EQ multi-brand compressor thing that kind of like artificial intelligence, you know, cleans up your mix for you. And I've used it sometimes to great success, and I've used it sometimes and been a bit like, I think that you can use these as, you know, a color, an option. And
yeah, I
feel like those kind of things, it's good to not rely on them too much because they don't always work with the source material, but I'm not against them because sometimes they do some really cool things. And I mean, I use a lot of kind of black box plugins and I love them, but it's just about kind of making sure you're always listening and you're not kind of using them to fix problems that are maybe compression problems or EQ problems or masking problems.
Interesting. Yeah, Greg's actually added a comment, which is, it makes my electronic drums sound amazing. That's all I know.
If it sounds amazing, go with it. I think
that's sick.
If you like it, then it's great.
We'll all be testing it later to see what we can throw into it. See what we can do with it, Greg. Thank you.
Is Greg from Kilohertz?
I don't think so. I don't think Greg is pushing a product per se. Yeah, okay. So we have another one from D Murray. Hi, D.
Hi,
I'm not sure if D is like your full name. Probably not, probably an abbreviation. There we go. So he would like to know, what do you use for monitoring while mixing?
I have used lots of different things. I think my favorite things to mix on are ATC 25s. I find that they are very unforgiving in a way that is great for me. I don't have them at home. I actually have, because me and my partner both do a similar job, and he has a hookup with Key 3. So I actually have Key 3s at home, and they again are brutal. But they tell me what I'm doing wrong very, very quickly. And then I also have these Sennheiser HD 600s. They're not the most recent of the Sennheisers, but they're what I'm used to. I think it's really good to have a pair of headphones that you trust and that you know really well. It just means you can kind of work anywhere. And even if you've got new speakers or a place with different speakers, you can check them against the headphones and then kind of figure out what they're telling you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I work in my studio. We have some Rocket KRKs, and they're great, but they have a sweetener in the presence area, And I realized that,
Oh, no, okay. And then you take them away and they sound like things sound a little flat.
yeah, that's right. And actually the first time I noticed that was because I took them into I took the mixes into Katie Tavini's studio, and Katie has some remarkable Adam audio.
B&Ws and the
Yeah.
She's got Adams, do you say?
I think she has Adams. Actually, no, maybe she switched it up now.
Ooh.
But I'll have to double check with her. But everything is designed, as you say, within Katie's studio because part of Katie's job is quality control. She has to be able to hear the mistakes.
Yeah.
So but also she listens to things very low.
Yeah.
So that was a transformative experience, and I realized, oh, I have some work to do.
It's like heartbreaking and also really good when you listen to something on a good set of monitors and you're like, oh, this is not there yet.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's what needs, it's like the tough love you need to get your mixes to the next next hurdle. Okay.
Tough love below.
Audio tough love. Okay, wicked. Right. So so you mentioned about having too much choice available when you were looking for a mix engineer, particularly when searching through social media. It can be a little bit like drowning in hyper choice. And thank you for the tip of a beautiful page does not always equal a creative match. I thought that was really smart. But off the back of that, what would you consider to be red flags, like maybe a couple of red flags when you're talking to a potential mix engineer? Like what would you be like, maybe not?
I think this, it kind of depends what you want. I think if you're a little bit anxious to trust somebody with your music, for instance, I would say that a mix engineer that charges for revisions would be a red flag for you, because then you don't have the freedom for that back and forth, and that can be quite a stressful experience if you're not getting on the same page. But it might not be a red flag if you're kind of happy to just let someone go ahead and do what they do. So it depends what you want. I think if for me, if someone wasn't really showing any curiosity as to what I wanted, I would feel that is a bit of a red flag. I think that if people are willing to, it's like a relationship. If people are willing to communicate, very few things are kind of deal breakers. But if they're kind of like, nope, I do what I do, and you're going to like it from them. For me, that wouldn't be someone that I'd want to leave my music with. But again, I can only kind of talk personally, but I hope that's helpful. That's kind of the energy that I'd be looking out for is someone that I feel like wants to talk about my music and wants to, geek out over some references and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, cool. So 2 questions from the stream. The first one is, do you mix in the box?
Yes. I have one piece of outboard that I use regularly. It's a Owl Smart C1. And that's just mix bus compression. Everything else in the box. I think the analog gear is great, but it's not recallable. And again, with modern technology, the good thing is that you can go back and forth and you can tweak. And if I'm using too much outboard and I'm having to take photos of everything, or I'm going to a studio and using a desk, I then need that studio to be free again before I can get back in and tweak your mix, which can be, it's just an added complication. And I think that the returns are minimal, to be honest.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think it's always it seems like such an individual perspective for people as to how much digital versus outboard they're willing to use.
I do have faders. I think that's one thing that I'm really glad that I invested in is I've got we've got an Avid S3. We got one secondhand. It's just like 16 faders. And it means that I can just do all my automation kind of on real faders rather than drawing it in, and that saves me loads of time, and it helps me feel I can't concentrate when I'm too in the box, when I'm like on my mouse and keyboard. So faders is a really happy medium because they're recallable, they're all digital, there's no analog circuitry there, but it just helps me get my hands on the mix in a more tactile way and a more.
That's fascinating. Do you feel like that's more to do with the fact that you are a more tactile person, or because you came up through like places like Strongroom, which have, you know, which are the big kind of desks with all the, you know, the kind of the hardware available, versus someone who might have come up through bedroom production?
I think it might be a bit of both. I think when I started to really embrace automation, I found that mixing in the box couldn't I couldn't get the flow in the way that I wanted to, because you have to kind of draw things or click on a screen. And I think I am quite a tactile person. I like to kind of engage with things. You know, I'll light a candle and put some mood lighting on before I do a mix. Like, I like to engage everything.
Yeah.
And kind of stay, even though I mix in the box, kind of stay out of the computer screen as much as possible. Try and make it not feel like I'm playing a computer game.
Do you like computer games, Jess?
I do, but I have to ration myself. I had a day off recently and I spent like 10 hours playing Pokemon.
Oh, hello.
I didn't even feel it. It just went. It was just that day gone.
No way. Woo! Gosh, yeah, that was a good chunk of my teenagehood, actually, was playing computer games for that length of time. Couldn't do it anymore, but yeah. Oh wow. Okay, wicked. Right. Another question from the stream. How do you approach panning mono versus stereo elements in your song space?
It depends. I think with stereo elements, I would say like drum overheads always hard left, hard right for me. Unless every now and again I'll do the trick where you kind of like pan it in a tiny bit and then like final chorus you just give it that last bit of mix bass. That can be quite fun, but usually it will be hard left, hard right all the way through. One thing I would say with panning is that it kind of depends. Your panning of stereo elements is going to be more or less successful depending on how you recorded it. So if you recorded like a coincident pair where you've got the capsules of the mics are in exactly the same place, you're not going to have time of arrival differences, which means that you're much more flexible in where you can pan it. You can even collapse it totally mono and you won't get phase issues.
Yes.
Whereas if you're doing something like a wide, maybe not when it's really wide and the sounds aren't correlated
really
wide. It doesn't matter. But if you've got two space cardioids kind of here on a piano, say, there's going to be differences in the time of arrival of the sound between each mic, and then when you sum them, some frequencies might disappear on you a little bit. So in that case, you can pan a little bit, like do a little bit of this, but I try and keep them then as wide as possible, because you know what you're doing when you're panning in from hard left and hard right is you're kind of summing a bit of the signal, and then you're going to get a bit of phase cancellation. So is that a really convoluted answer?
I didn't think so. I understood.
That's so if I'm getting a mix and I don't know how something is recorded, I kind of just listen. It's most annoying. I used to hate it when people who were better than me, or like teachers or people who were guiding me, would just be like, just listen to it. I'd be like, oh. But it really is, you know, if you've got a stereo pair, you don't know how it was recorded, maybe sum it to mono and see what happens. If it goes all weird and frequencies disappear, then keep them wide. But if you're not getting problems, then you're kind of free to do what you want. And then mono sources, like they can go wherever you want, just wherever sounds good.
Just drop it in the stereo field, see what
Automate
happens.
it all over, have it going left to right, like oh man.
I love doing everything. I love doing that sometimes, just like popping things into mono and then slinging them somewhere. It's really, really fun. It's like a fun way of just like giving your arrangement some spice.
if you listen to a lot of my mixes, I always do the like the little ear candy that starts off in the middle and kind of goes, wow.
Yeah.
Now I've said that, like, if you're gonna totally, if you listen to my mixes, you're
I
gonna
will.
because it's always satisfying. I'm not sick of it yet, so
No, same. I did the same thing because actually I was really lucky. I did a remix of a friend's track. My friend Shah let me remix her track Narc last year.
Ooh.
And I think it was last year or early this year. And it was really, actually it was early this year, but it was really fun because she'd put in about half a dozen panned ear candy elements, and those are just gold for remixes because
so much fun. Yeah,
I know. And also, you know, it's one of these things where sometimes they really stand out in the mix, and sometimes they get a little bit buried in the mix, especially if there's like lots of layers going on, or you know, lots of kind of elements that fall into similar frequencies. So it was really fun to basically take those elements and give them all their individual spaces. So yeah, I'm totally on the same page as you at that point. Okay, sick. So you were talking earlier about the primacy effect and familiarity bias, particularly the second one. How do you have any tips for how artists can get into the habit of fighting that?
I mean, I think the main way at the moment for me is to limit your listening to your production demo. And I think if you've not listened to your production demo in a while and you get the mix back and you start with your references and then go to the mix, your ears are kind of primed. You're kind of using familiarity bias with you rather than against you, because you're kind of priming your brain to want the sounds that you really want rather than the sounds that you're just familiar with. So that's kind of how I would tackle it, I guess. Apart from that, what would I do apart from that? Not really sure. Lots of ear breaks, lots of no repeat button, and lots of ear breaks. I make myself a lot of tea because I'm fighting the same thing. Like you know, when I load in someone's stems, especially if it's a producer that I really love, I kind of be like, oh no, but your production mix is wicked. I don't want to change it.
How do I replicate it exactly to the reference mix?
No, honestly, sometimes I'm just like, damn, like you want me to beat this? Yikes.
Yeah, it does get like that sometimes. I've worked on a couple of mixes where I've just sort of been like sometimes you get a mix and you're like, yeah, I know exactly what to do with this, like it's immediate. But then sometimes you get something you're like, you've done a really good job there.
What you want from me.
Yeah, it's tough. Okay, cool, amazing. So all right, we'll probably make this the last one because I feel like things are winding down a bit in the chat. So what is the most frequent faux pas you find artists and producers doing during the pre-mix process, so when they're preparing stuff for your mix?
Things not cross-faded. Auto-tune on vocals is so difficult to prise off people, especially when it's like an artist producer and it's their own vocals. I feel like I'm having to like snatch the auto-tune away from them. I had one person just completely completely refused to admit there was any auto-tune. He was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what tune? I was like, bro,
really? Oh wow.
And eventually I had to sit down and be like, look, whatever you sound like without autotune, it's fine. And we've all heard it before. This might be a really am I gonna say this? Yeah, I'm gonna say this. You know, like when you go to a gynae and you're like really angry, but you know it's just not a big deal to them.
Yeah.
I was really wondering if I was gonna go there, but that's the experience I relate to.
Sure.
And it's the thing, you know, it's very vulnerable to just send someone like, here's my voice, I'm singing about my ex, very emotional, and I'm not totally in tune, but it's like no one is. Like you literally, like, you just never have to worry, like especially if you're if you're dealing with a professional, like they're not gonna
Mm.
rinse you for your vocal performance. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I can count on one hand the number of people I've met over the years who have perfect pitch.
yeah,
It's so rare. Like, we don't expect that from people.
no, but I think you know what's insidious as well is this, especially outside of pop and outside of more like produced genres, people are not honest about. I think in pop you can't be dishonest about processing because everyone knows that
Everyone's using it.
everyone's using it, everyone's doing it. But I think especially like in jazz, like I've seen people really compare themselves and really kind of beat themselves up for not being as good as X person. And it's like, X person has a copy of Melodyne. Like, you don't need to, and it's kind of just not taken for granted that it's going to be processed in the same way. And from my experience, like, it totally is. Like,
Yeah.
and
That's fascinating. So it's almost like that sense of consciousness around tools like Melodyne or autotune just hasn't really it hasn't become a part of the kind of the vocabulary and the expectation of music outside of pop music.
no, and I think it's kind of, and I think also people aren't necessarily aware of all the ways that people can alter a performance that aren't auto-tune. Like, I think in classical fields especially, like I've seen some scores that are edited up like half a bar of take 26 and then a bar and a half of take 47, and they've played it 100 times and they're really jigsawing it together, and what you're hearing is not by any means a full performance. And people are holding themselves to that standard, and they're like, why can't I get a perfect take of this? And I'm like, that person couldn't get a perfect take of that. Like,
yeah, totally. Like, and I think a lot of it is time as well. It's time versus and convenience versus kind of performance. Because I know that, because I mean, I like two examples is like one, seeing Billie Eilish and Phineas on the, I think is it Dave Letterman Presents, or there was a series on Netflix recently, and yeah, it's really good because they show just how many takes Billie does and where all the comps are, and it is literally a line at a time, sometimes a word at a time, and we're talking like a stack of 70 takes that have been comped together, and it's fascinating to, and she has no problem sharing that. Like, she's not precious about it. She basically just says, no, this is, as far as I'm concerned, I want the best possible vocal performance, and this is what it takes to get there in terms of the delivery of the song within the performance within the record, not necessarily because live is considered a different animal. And I found that totally fascinating, because the second example, I'm someone who's been singing for 25 years, and I know that if I can't nail it in 3 takes, it's not going to happen.
And singers either are one or the other. Like, it's either 3 takes and you're done, or it's like they're going to take an hour to warm up, and then the good stuff's going to happen. Like,
yeah, and it's been quite fascinating, because I think in the past like 3 to 4 years I've been playing with different approaches to that, rather than feeling like I need to be stoic about it. But I think it is more to do with that sense of broadcasting, making it very clear to your artists and producers, we don't expect perfection from you. That's why you're hiring us.
Yeah,
we're all just reaching for the best possible record, right? Yeah,
exactly. And it's kind of like, it's and it doesn't take away from what you do. It's like it's all incremental. Me sending mix off to be mastered doesn't mean that that my mixing skills aren't up to par. It's just like,
yeah,
sometimes it does, but it doesn't necessarily.
Confession time.
Oh man, I was talking to my friend Lorenz, and we were talking about Katie, and I was like, you know what? There are some things on streaming services that I do not deserve them to sound as good as they do. And it's literally Katie just being like, I think this is what you meant.
Yeah, I totally understand. I think as well, like getting a better understanding of how mastering fits into the process is only something I've since spending time with Katie Tavini, both just in passing discussion, in discussion about projects, in watching her do it, with my stuff, in watching her do it with other people's stuff, and starting to understand where that kind of cherry on top sits in the process, and that it's not a pedantic thing. It's something that is genuinely bringing it up to a higher standard, a higher quality of sound. And that's been so helpful to get my head around, really, as a music maker. Because I mean, I meet people still who say, do I need mastering? And these people have been in the music industry for a while, so I think it's been really helpful to get my own head around that, so that I can say with absolute confidence, yes you do.
Well, I often say as well, I just be like, oh, let's try, like, let's send one. Mastering in terms of expense, it's definitely not the most expensive part of the process by any stretch.
No.
What's your favorite song? Let's get it mastered, and then you can decide whether you think it's worth it. And without fail, they're like, okay, let's send the rest. I really like it.
Yeah, I think also in terms of like the way that we experience the dynamics of the music that we submit to that process as well. I think that was the thing that I always found the most stark in terms of particularly Katie's work, but with other mastering engineers as well, is that sense of dynamic elevation, and realizing that sometimes there's things that, like, it's like the whole thing of sometimes the best idea isn't yours. Like, what's your vision for it, what's their vision for it, and how is it just an elevation or an amplification of what you had in mind?
100%. I've had things where, like, masters have brought out something, especially when people kind of do like mid-side stuff, they brought out the sides a little bit more, and I kind of go, oh God, I really didn't pay enough attention to that little sax lick or that whatever, and now it's been mastered and I'm like, ooh, like, I missed that one. It's definitely, I love the collaborative. I think it's different, you absolutely can kind of take a project from conception to release by yourself. And there are some incredibly talented people who do just that, but I think that there's so much value in kind of passing it on to the next person and just seeing, like, what do they add, and each person kind of adds something that nobody else could.
Yeah, totally.
It's a really lovely part of the process for me.
Joyful collaboration.
Yeah, we love it. We love to see it.
Cool. I think we'll leave it there, shall we?
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really good fun. I've just been like jamming out to 30-second
clips.
Clips in my room.
No, it's been great. Thank you so much for coming along, Jess. Where can people find you on the internet?
At Jess.Camilleri on Instagram is pretty much the only social media I have.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, that's where you'll find me. And if you search my name on Tidal, then something come up.
Yeah, and you're also listed on the Strongroom's website as part of their team, and you can see some of the work that's done there. Okay, brilliant. Right, for those who haven't come across We Move series before, We Move is 25 seminars that are led by experts in music and tech, and just happen to be women and gender minority. So if you would like to find more, you can find them on Music Hackspace's YouTube channel. You'll be able to find the playback of this particular session as well as the previous ones. They're all yours for free. Go and play and have fun. Also, you can find out more about Music Hackspace and the resources and the courses that we have available on musichackspace.org. We are on all of the social medias as Music Hackspace. So yeah, we hope you've enjoyed this session, and Jess and I can stay on Zoom for a minute, but the rest of you can all go and have your dinner or your beer or your tea or whatever you have of an evening, and we'll see you at the next one. So we'll see you then. Bye. And this is the bit where I have to wait until I finish speaking on YouTube and then I can end the stream. And I know that I'm literally just like waiting for me to wave at myself.
That's good. It's good to put that there as a little, like a clapperboard.
Yeah, it pretty much is. So there we go. I think I'm just about to wave. There we are.
That is a lag, isn't it?
Yeah, it was long this time.